So I'm Courtney Polenick. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and social work at the University of Michigan. And I'm excited to tell you about our work on extradyadic social interactions, which are interactions outside of a dyad, and physiological synchrony in couples living with dementia. So first, a little bit on the background and aims of our study. So we know from extensive research that spouses influence one another's health and well-being due to shared environments, shared activities, and just generally spending a lot of time together. And we know also that these influences may become stronger with age as couples develop chronic conditions and manage stress related to those conditions. We also know that couples often show physiological synchrony or linked patterns in their stress reactivity. So when we think about synchrony, this would be levels and changes in terms of our stress responses. And then how does that change in one partner in relation to the other partner? And this has been examined in a variety of indicators in the broader literature, including blood pressure, electrodermal activity, heart rate, cortisol, and alpha amylase. And we know that synchrony may reflect empathic interactions that are beneficial to health, but synchrony also could pose health risks, especially if one partner is stressed. The other partner could also show elevated stress responses. So physiological synchrony in the broader literature has been examined as both positive and negative associations between partners' biological measures over time. And this has been considered in terms of in-phase synchrony and anti-phase synchrony. So in-phase synchrony is mutual changes in the same direction. So when both partners' stress responses increase at the same time, whereas anti-phase synchrony is showing mutual changes in the opposite direction. So for example, when one partner's stress response increases, the other partner's stress response decreases. So we're really interested in understanding these two patterns of synchrony. And most studies in the literature on older couples have not distinguished between these two types of synchrony. So they're really just looking at, are couples synchronous in their patterns, but not really looking at the nature of that synchrony. But looking at in-phase and anti-phase synchrony is important because this may involve different interpersonal processes within dyads. So when we think about couples living with dementia, they're facing a lot of new chronic stressors. So for example, behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia that the person living with dementia is managing, but also the partner is managing, as well as the relationship changes. So often the person living with dementia is starting to need a little bit more support from the partner. And when we think about couples, it's also important to think about their interactions with other people outside the dyad. So we call these extradyadic interactions to really try to understand the extent to which interactions with people outside of the couple relationship is a source of support or strain for that couple. And given that these interactions may both kind of help to manage stress, but also may be a source of stress, they may impact the nature and extent of physiological synchrony in couples. So for this study, we were interested in evaluating the concurrent or same day and also the microlagged or next day associations between daily extradyadic interactions and synchrony in salivary cortisol and alpha amylase among couples living with dementia. So these are two really important biological markers of stress. And we were interested in examining both in-phase and anti-phase synchrony in these biological markers. So the data are from the Couples Wellbeing and Everyday Life study, or the CWEL study. And the overall goal of this study was to try to understand how daily stress and positive events in couples living with dementia are associated with well-being, self-care, and biological stress responses. And this study recruited a total of 40 married or cohabiting couples who included one partner living with early stage dementia. And we had a total of 34 people living with dementia and their spouses for this particular study. And this was based on just having usable data for salivary cortisol and alpha amylase. And both of the partners completed initial phone interviews and 7 days of brief morning and evening phone interviews. And they also had 4 days of saliva sample collection. So saliva samples were collected 4 times per day, waking, 30 minutes after waking, before lunch, and before bed. And this occurred on days 2 through 5 of the daily phone interviews. So for the measures, again, we focused on cortisol and alpha amylase because these are both really important to the stress response. And for both of these measures, we looked at the awakening response, which is waking to 30 minutes after waking. And for cortisol, typically we see a spike in cortisol starting about 30 minutes after waking, whereas for alpha amylase, we typically see a drop right after awakening. So we're interested in understanding the awakening response. Also, we are interested in the wake-evening slope. So this is looking at the slope 30 minutes after waking to bedtime. So basically how levels of each marker change across the day. And typically for cortisol, we see gradual decreases, whereas for alpha amylase, we see gradual increases across the day. And then finally, we were interested in looking at the area under the curve with respect to ground, which is basically looking at the total output of both cortisol and alpha amylase. Looking at positive extradyadic interactions. So in the evening interviews, participants were asked if they shared a good laugh with someone other than your partner today, or if they had an experience with a close friend or relative that most people would consider positive. And if they answered yes to either of these questions, they received a score of 1 or a score of 0 if they answered no to both questions. So this was really looking at the presence of a positive interaction with somebody outside the dyad. And the negative extradyadic interactions were assessed from an item asking participants in the evening interview, did you feel irritated, hurt by, or annoyed with someone else other than your partner today? If they answered yes, they received a score of 1, and if they answered no, they received a score of 0. So for the analysis, we estimated longitudinal actor-partner interdependence models, and we were really wanting to understand within couple associations between cortisol and alpha amylase across 7 days, and also how these associations varied by daily positive and negative extradyadic interactions. And for each model, we included same-day partner mean-centered cortisol and alpha amylase as the predictor, and actor cortisol or alpha amylase as the outcome. And we had separate models for both of these biomarkers. We then looked at two-way interactions between partner mean-centered cortisol or alpha amylase and person mean-centered positive or negative extradyadic interactions. And the models controlled for same-day and previous day positive or negative intradyadic interactions because we were really interested in understanding how positive and negative interactions with people outside the dyad influence synchrony over and above how couples are influencing one another in their positive and negative interactions. And these measures were parallel to the extradyadic measures. So looking next at the main results. So we found for positive extradyadic interactions, when people living with dementia reported positive extradyadic interactions, there's in-phase synchrony or positive association in cortisol area under the curve on the same day, but there was anti-phase synchrony or a negative association in alpha amylase wake-evening slope on the next day. We also found that when spouses reported positive extradyadic interactions, we found in-phase synchrony in alpha amylase area under the curve and wake-evening slope on the next day. So taking a look at some of these findings, we found that there was anti-phase synchrony on the next day when people living with dementia were reporting a positive extradyadic interaction. But interestingly, we found in-phase synchrony on the next day when people living with dementia did not report a positive extradyadic interaction, which could indicate that when they're not getting positive social interaction outside the dyad, there might be more influences on people living with dementia in terms of physiological synchrony. We also found that there was in-phase synchrony on the next day when spouses reported positive extradyadic interactions. But this was not the case, and we see an opposite pattern, although not significant, when they did not report positive extradyadic interactions. Looking at negative extradyadic interactions on days when people living with dementia reported negative extradyadic interactions, there was in-phase synchrony or negative association in alpha amylase wake-evening slope. And on days when spouses reported negative extradyadic interactions, there was also anti-phase synchrony or negative association in alpha amylase awakening response. So taking a look at these findings, we see that there's anti-phase synchrony on the same day when people living with dementia reported a negative interaction. And similarly, there's anti-phase synchrony on the same day when spouses reported having a negative extradyadic interaction. So turning to summary of the findings and main conclusion, we found that couples showed in-phase synchrony or positive association in cortisol and alpha amylase, but particularly alpha amylase, when people living with dementia or their spouses reported positive extradyadic interactions. So this might suggest that couples could be more in tune physiologically when one or both partners in the couple have positive social experiences outside the couple relationship. And this occurred on the same day for both people living with dementia and their spouses, and on the next day for spouses. So it suggests that there could be benefits that even carry over into the next day for spouses. We also found anti-phase synchrony or a negative association occurring the day after people living with dementia had positive extradyadic interactions and when people living with dementia or their spouses had negative extradyadic interactions. So we think positive social interactions we know can also be stressful, and cognitive impairment does present challenges for interaction, such as communication difficulties and forgetting things like names, faces, or events that can be often stressful for people living with dementia and their spouses. So it could be that the day after these interactions happen, there could be some stress that both partners are managing. And we think that we might be seeing these opposite patterns in physiological reactivity in couples because they may be engaging in dyadic coping. So for example, one partner might be sharing their emotions while the other partner listens calmly and provides support. And that could be why we're seeing opposite patterns in their physiological stress responses. So overall, this study suggests that physiological synchrony in couples living with dementia may be influenced over and above their own relationship by social interactions that they're having with people outside of the relationship. And importantly, we found that both the extradyadic interactions reported by people living with dementia and their spouses were independently predictive of synchrony. So these findings really underscore the importance of capturing daily experiences reported and experienced by both people living with dementia and their spouses or care partners. And for acknowledgements, I'd like to acknowledge our funding, our research participants, our lab members, and collaborators for this particular study. And thank you so much for your time. I welcome your questions.